Hello, my name is Gary Zamet. I am President and CEO of Clinilabs. Clinilabs is a contract research organization that provides early phase and specialty clinical drug development services to industry. I'm going to talk to you today about expanding your practice by participating in clinical trials. Clinical trials are research studies that involve human subjects that serve to characterize drugs under development. These studies examine their safety, tolerability, and adverse effects in healthy subjects, and also document their efficacy and safety in patient populations. Clinical trials are the most important and costly phase of the drug development process. According to industry reports, the pharmaceutical industry spent about $50 billion of research and development in 2008, with clinical development costs representing approximately 60% of these expenditures. The data derived from the conduct of clinical trials are critical to the delivery of new therapeutics to the market. These data ultimately drive the drug development life cycle and provide important information to regulatory authorities. Many physicians in private practice are interested in participating in these trials. They want to be part of the process that brings better and safer medicines to patients in need, but they just don't know where to begin. Today's presentation will focus on the following objectives. In today's short presentation, I'll hope to provide you with an understanding of the purpose of clinical trials. I'll hope to offer you information about the types of clinical trials conducted in private practice settings, discuss factors that must be weighed when considering participation in a clinical trial as an investigator, and I'll hope to offer you some understanding about the risks and benefits of serving as a clinical trial investigator. And finally, I'll give you some information about how you can participate in clinical trials. Now, clinical trials are So clinical trials are experiments designed to test the efficacy, safety, and tolerability of drugs, devices, or procedures such as surgical procedures. We're going to focus today primarily on the conduct of trials related to drugs and devices. Now, clinical trials are conducted in 3 different phases prior to a drug's approval. These are phases 1, 2, and 3. One additional phase includes studies conducted after marketing approval. Trials are performed during the first of these phases of clinical development in phase 1 and provide important information that constitutes the drug manufacturer's evidence for carrying a drug forward and forms the basis of the new drug application that is submitted to the FDA or other regulatory authority. Although these early phase studies although all of these studies are presented in phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, it's very common for these studies to overlap or even run concurrently. For example, a phase 2 study of a drug's efficacy in a patient population may be in progress when an important phase 1 drug study is initiated. We know overall that the cost of doing these clinical studies is significant. An analysis conducted in 2007 estimated that the total combined cost of the preclinical and clinical trials required to bring a drug to the point of submission of a new drug application is over $1.2 billion. This expense includes the costs of drugs that fail to progress through the clinical development pipeline, and as well as drugs that finally make it to approval. For every 250 drugs that complete preclinical testing, only 5 will successfully complete phase 1, and only 1 will ultimately achieve regulatory approval. Now let's talk a little bit more about these 4 phases of clinical research. If you look at the center of your screen, you'll see phase 1 trials. In these studies, researchers test an investigational drug or device in a small group of people, say 20 to 100 people, usually normal, healthy volunteers, although increasingly study designs call for the introduction of patient cohorts in these studies. These studies are designed to determine the metabolic and pharmacologic actions of a drug in humans, assess the side effects associated with the drug at various doses, and if possible, to gain early evidence regarding drug effects using biomarkers or tests in small cohorts of patients. Common studies conducted in this phase of drug development are first-in-human studies, single ascending dose studies, multiple ascending dose studies, drug-drug interaction studies, and food-drug interaction studies. During phase 1, sufficient information about the drug's pharmacokinetics is obtained to permit the later design of well-controlled, scientifically valid, and safe phase 2 studies. Phase 1 studies also evaluate the drug's metabolism, structure-activity relationships, the mechanism of action in humans, and drug-drug interactions, as I mentioned. Overall, in phase 1, this is where we gain critical insight into a drug's absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. Now let's move on to phase 2 studies. During phase 2, an investigational drug or device is given to a larger group of people, typically 100 to 500 people, to evaluate the efficacy and effectiveness of that drug for a particular indication or indications in patients with the disease or condition under study. Phase 2 studies also aim to determine the common short-term side effects and risks associated with the drug or device under evaluation. In clinical trials, it's common for phase 2 studies to identify primary outcomes that will possibly be used in later pivotal trials, and then determine the types of adverse experiences that people report. So here, again, it's common to study smaller groups of patients to provide information that determines the drug dose or doses that will be carried forward into larger phase 3 studies to determine the types of AEs or adverse experiences that will be looked at, and to weigh the trade-offs in study design that may have to be made as the drug manufacturer approaches later phase studies. Now let's take a look at phase 3. In phase 3, this is the drug manufacturer's most important opportunity to document the efficacy and safety of a drug under development. 1,000 to 5,000 candidates may be studied, and these studies are designed to gather critical information regarding the overall benefit-risk relationship of a drug, as well as provide an adequate basis for labeling of the drug, that is, the package insert contents and indication. By the time a drug enters this phase of testing, characteristics about its absorption, distribution, metabolism, and elimination are known. The drug's likely therapeutic effects have been defined and reduced to testable hypotheses, and the safety profile of the drug has been reasonably characterized. Manufacturers who initiate phase 3 trials generally are confident that their product will be shown to be safe and effective and ultimately win regulatory approval. Even though the odds of success are much higher for a drug product at this point than when entering preclinical evaluations, keep in mind that, again, only 1 out of every 5 drugs that enters phase 2 testing will successfully complete phase 3, leading to a marketed product. Now, phase 4 is not on the graphic that I'm showing you, but I think it's important for you to know what phase 4 studies are. These are studies that are typically conducted after a new drug application has been approved by a regulatory authority, such as the FDA. These studies may be conducted to further clarify the efficacy and safety of a drug, and pharmacovigilance, pharmacoeconomic, or comparative efficacy studies may be performed during this phase of a drug's life cycle. In some cases, new or specific patient populations that go beyond the original indication or that better characterize the indication may be pursued. Elderly, pediatric, or other patient groups could become a focus of research. And finally, there are occasions when Phase 4 trials provide some important information that could be used to revise drug labeling, including the addition of additional safety information, or that could support a manufacturer's decision to pursue what is called a secondary new drug application, or SNDA, that seeks approval for a new therapeutic indication. Now, let's talk about what physicians in private practice may wish to consider when they're considering participation in a clinical trial. Now, most often, physicians in private practice participate in Phase 2 to 4 studies. Since Phase 1 studies are highly intensive studies that require overnight stays, specialized procedures such as frequent blood sampling, sample processing, and standard operating procedures that define all of these processes, most clinicians participate in work in later phases, Phase 2, 3, or 4. Now, there are ways that physicians can participate in Phase 1 studies from their private practice offices, but let's focus mostly on Phase 2 through 4. In these cases, physicians typically receive highly structured research protocols. These protocols define the nature and the scope of the clinical trial to be conducted. In many ways, getting a protocol makes it easy to participate in a clinical trial because the protocol specifies exactly what must be done to select patients and to conduct the trial. However, for some people, the protocol itself can be challenging because it may demand that the clinician diverge from his or her routine clinical practices in order to conduct a trial. So, in considering whether or not one would be interested in participating in clinical trials, one question to ask may be whether or not one can truly follow a protocol that may diverge from typical clinical practice. And it's important that the clinical trial protocol be followed to the letter because there are potential penalties for protocol deviations or violations. Now, one of the things that practicing physicians should know is that by the time an investigational medication reaches Phase 2 or particularly Phase 3, much information is known about the safety and tolerability of the drug under study. And all of this information is contained in an investigator brochure. The investigator brochure is a document that describes not only the investigational product itself, but all results from prior testing with that drug, animal data, as well as the earlier phase human data. This investigator's brochure enables the physician investigator to make an informed decision about participating in the trial. Is this an area that I want to work in? Does the investigational drug look promising? Do I think it's reasonable to expose my patients to this investigational drug? Is there a reasonable risk-benefit ratio here for my patients? So the investigational brochure is one other thing to consider, and the information contained therein. Now, when I talk to physicians about participating in clinical trials, many of them are relieved to know that no special clinical skills are typically required. For people who are practicing in a particular subspecialty of medicine, they're recognized as experts in their field, and they're probably performing many, if not all, of the tasks required by a clinical study protocol. Now, some protocols may require additional testing or additional procedures. That's true. But very often, the procedures required include the types of assessments and the types of treatment and follow-up that physicians are used to engaging in their offices. However, that said, special training and resources may be needed. Training in good clinical practices is required. Very often, if the study involves more than just a few patients, someone in the physician's office who's going to be dedicated, at least part-time, to managing clinical study documents and coordinating patient visits is important. This is the work of a clinical research coordinator. And then finally, drug storage and accountability is important, and there are strict rules regarding the way investigational products have to be stored and accounted for. So those physicians who wish to participate as principal investigators in clinical trials need some proper training and need to make sure that they have the appropriate staff and facilities, equipment, and other resources necessary to conduct the clinical trial. Now, physicians also may ask, as a non-scientist, what value do I really provide to the conduct of a clinical trial? Well, as I mentioned earlier, drug manufacturers who are seeking physicians to participate in clinical trials look for physicians with clinical acumen, physicians who are good diagnosticians, physicians who know their patients, and who can identify patients who are appropriate for study. Every clinical trial protocol has inclusion and exclusion criteria that must be met in order for a patient to participate in a trial. So understanding the diagnostic procedures, understanding the needs of one's own patients, and good skill in managing patients while they're in a clinical trial are all reasons that pharmaceutical manufacturers look for good physicians to participate in these trials. Another element of clinical research involves providing informed consent or obtaining informed consent from the patient. Informed consent must be obtained in written form, so the physician who is involved in the trial must explain the trial to the patient, enable the patient to read an informed consent document, and obtain appropriate signatures to indicate that the patient is agreeable and willing to participate in the trial. The informed consent process, as well as other practices to protect human rights in clinical research, are governed by human rights or ethics committees known as institutional review boards. All clinical trials are reviewed and approved by institutional review boards if they are compliant with regulations in the United States and abroad. So clinical acumen is one thing that sponsors of clinical trials look for, but the next thing that they also look for is access to a patient population. Clinicians have caseloads or patient databases that they know. Doctors know their patients, and they know who might be appropriate for participation in a trial. And that is another reason that pharmaceutical manufacturers go into the community to work with physicians in communities where clinical trials may be appropriately conducted. Now, what are the benefits of participation? There may be many benefits that one in private practice can realize. Participating in a clinical trial exposes a physician to new scientific information, information about new treatment approaches, information about mechanisms of action of therapeutics under development that is not available to the general public or to another professional audience, information about new concepts or understanding about the diagnosis or treatment or pathophysiology of an illness. Secondly, physicians who participate in clinical trials have an opportunity at investigator meetings and beyond to interact with other physicians who are participating in clinical researches. These are some of the most curious minds that are in the profession, and people who enjoy talking about ways that they can help patients better, talking about ways that they can better diagnose and treat illness. Third, participation in clinical trials involves the testing of investigational medications. And because of this, physicians who are participating are often working with what I would call leading-edge treatment options. These are treatment options that may ultimately become prescription products later on, should they prove to be safe and effective, and should they win regulatory approval. Physicians who participate in trials gain an early understanding of these new treatments under development. And, of course, by participating in a clinical trial, there become opportunities for publication or presentation. Now, we know that physicians in private practice must be compensated for their time, and there is financial compensation for participation in clinical trials. The procedures that are performed by the study physician are paid for. Okay, so let's take a look at the risks of participation. What are they? Well, I've tried to summarize them here. I may not have covered them all adequately, but I think one of the greatest risks of participation is that a clinical trial may add burden to the private practitioner that actually takes time away from routine clinical practice. If one doesn't have adequate time to read a protocol, understand it, and be able to execute it effectively, then it creates really a stressful burden on a practice. So that's one of the risks, is that this is additional responsibility, it's additional clinical responsibility, and there is a weighty demand to perform the trial exactly in accordance with the protocol. Another consideration is professional liability. Physicians who are interested in participating in trials should look at their professional liability policies to make sure that their participation in research is covered. As I mentioned earlier, that you may need additional staff or resources, such as a clinical research coordinator, which must be managed. That person has to be hired, trained, and that person is someone who is key to maintaining study activity. Additional equipment may be needed if a study calls for blood sampling and freezing at an ultra-low temperature, -20 degrees, for example. One must ensure that the proper equipment is in place. So the management of additional staff and resources is really critical. Then there is always the risk of falling out of compliance with the requirements of the FDA or other regulatory authority. In the United States, we comply with the regulations of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Failure to comply brings with it significant penalties, so one must be certain that one can work in compliance with those FDA requirements and guidelines. And next, if we think about the patients for a moment, keep in mind that in clinical trials, some treatment conditions that are under study may include the delivery of placebo to the patient. So there could be a patient group that doesn't get an active drug treatment, they're getting a sugar pill, or there could be a time during the treatment of the patient where the patient is not getting active drug. And one must consider whether or not they are prepared to work with patients under those circumstances in the context of a clinical trial. And then finally, last but not least, is to consider the potential risks of patient adverse events when administering any drug, and certainly any investigational drug, one must consider the adverse events that may arise during the course of a trial and weigh these against the overall care of the patient. Now, if you are considering participation in clinical trials, there are a few different models that you may wish to look at. One is participation as a principal investigator. Principal investigator assumes full responsibility for the clinical trial that he or she is conducting in his private practice. All principal investigators in the United States sign a form called the 1572 form, and this is a form that legally obligates the investigator to perform duties in accordance with federal regulations. So that is one role that can be taken in a clinical trial. Another model may be a principal investigator and sub-investigator model. This might be most appropriate for medical groups where one physician is the identified principal investigator and other physicians in the group who are interested, who are dedicated, who want to gain experience and exposure to research become sub-investigators. Now, in that model, the principal investigator still signs the 1572 form. That person is ultimately responsible for everything that happens in the trial, but that person is working with trusted colleagues alongside him or her to make sure that the trial is executed according to protocol. Finally, one can simply serve as a sub-investigator, as in the model I mentioned above, but there also are other ways to serve as a sub-investigator. In some cases, a sub-investigator may be outside of a practice that's doing the research, and that sub-investigator may simply screen patients to be referred to another medical practice or clinical research location. That is one model that we use at CliniLabs to identify patients that are appropriate for our studies. We have clinician sub-investigators in the community who refer patients to us who they believe may be appropriate for study. Now, how do you participate if you are still interested in doing so? So the best advice that I can offer is to sign up. Every contract research organization has a database of investigators that characterizes the investigators by subspecialty or specialty and subspecialty, geographic location, patient population, and once you're in a CRO database, you now open yourself up to the opportunity of getting what are called requests for information, or RFIs. So when a CRO has a potential project, that CRO can contact you by typically fax or email and inquire as to your interest in participating in a trial. So signing up is the first recommendation I can make to those of you who are interested in participating in trials. If you're interested in participating in trials with CliniLabs, you can go to our website, clinilabs.com, and go to the tab that says Investigators, and there you'll be offered, as with any CRO, the opportunity to register. Secondly, you can visit clinical trial information websites and contact project managers for those studies that you might be interested in participating in. There are two excellent websites that can give you this information. One is www.clinicaltrials.gov. That is a federally sponsored website that registers all clinical trials being conducted in the United States. And the other is www.centerwatch.com, which identifies also clinical trials that are underway. Now let me give you just a sample of what you might see if you were to go to clinicaltrials.gov. I just captured this as one example of a study that is currently recruiting participants and captured a snapshot of the information. This is not the full file, but just a snapshot of a bit of that file that shows you what the study is. This is a phase 3 study comparing 2 doses of an investigational drug versus placebo for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis in patients on other background arthritis medications. It's currently recruiting. The data on this website were recently verified by the drug company sponsor, and the purpose of the study is clearly indicated. But here you can see that you're given contact information so that if you're interested as a physician in participating in this trial, you may call and inquire about your participation. Third, how do you participate? Virtually every major pharma and device company has a small grant program that supports investigator-initiated proposals. So, for example, if in your clinical practice you're using a medication with a particular patient population or in a particular way that you think may be advantageous for others to learn about or know about, if you had some clinical data on this topic, you can submit typically a short synopsis that's maybe a 1- or 2-page study proposal and study design, and that can be considered by the clinical development teams inside the pharma or device company. It's an excellent way to marry an interest in research with perhaps a unique area of endeavor that you've identified in your clinical practice. And then finally, as I mentioned, another way to participate in clinical trials is to partner with a local research center. For example, in New York City, Clinilabs operates a 48-bed clinical research unit on the west side of Manhattan, and we do partner with local physicians who work in their private offices as sub-investigators and who refer patients to us for participation in early phase studies. We do mostly early phase and phase 1 studies. So Clinilabs, as well as other organizations like ours, welcome that kind of participation. So I hope that today's session has provided you with some interesting and valuable information about clinical trials, and that we have achieved our objective of giving you an understanding of what clinical trials are, what are the factors that you should consider if you're interested in participating, the benefits and the risks for you and your patients, and the ways you can go about participating in clinical trials if you'd like to do so today. I'm going to be available for questions. If you do have questions, please enter them in the question box on your website, and I will respond. And again, thank you for taking time out of your busy practices to participate in this session today. Okay, one question has just come up. And the question is, I'm interested in getting phase 1 work for my site. Any suggestions? Well, I have two suggestions. One is that phase 1 research can be highly specialized. So if you are not a phase 1 research site, it may be very challenging to win phase 1 studies for your site. There are a number of specialty phase 1 units in the United States as well as outside of the United States that tend to be the preferred locations for phase 1 work that is sponsored by pharma and biotech companies. So it can be challenging, but again, not impossible. If you are a phase 1 site and you're looking for work, I have some ideas for you as well. So first, if you're not a phase 1 site, one of the things that you can do if you're already conducting phase 2 or 3 or 4 studies is to try and leverage your relationships with the sponsors of those trials and let them know that you're interested in doing early phase work. Very often, that word of mouth will carry forward into a company and identify you as a person who can provide services, or your site as a site that can provide services. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, register with a CRO. get into the CRO databases. There are many CROs that look for good phase 1 sites to work with, and I would say, register, let the CRO know that you've got experience in phase 2 or 3 or 4, and that you want experience in phase 1. And then thirdly, if you're already a phase 1 site, I would, and you're looking for more phase 1 work, I would encourage you also to register with CROs, as well as some pharma companies that have databases. Register with the CROs, get your name in there so that when the CROs get studies, that you can be sent an RFI, you can respond, and hopefully be considered for a study. Question, okay, here comes a question, I think it's from the same person, which is, how do I find these CROs? Well, you can do so in a couple of ways. First, you can simply Google contract research organizations, and you will find that there are long lists of CROs that will pop up on virtually any Google search. The largest CROs in the industry are companies like Quintiles, Covance, Icon, Parexel, and PharmaNet, and others. So that may get you started in terms of gaining entry into some databases, but I would encourage you to go onto the internet and identify all of the CROs that are out there, because while we know that there are some top 10 CROs, there are a lot of smaller CROs that are also very busy and looking for phase 1 facilities. Okay, a new question. Other than clinicaltrials.gov and CenterWatch, are there any other sites that you would recommend for finding new studies? That's the question. I think really those are the two best sites to identify new studies that may be coming out. There are some databases that are professional databases that that CROs may use to try to track drugs under development. So they follow drugs that go from preclinical or animal testing into phase 1 but those are purchased by subscription. You have to pay money to get those. You can get really pretty good information from clinicaltrials.gov and from CenterWatch just by reading and looking creatively at what they have. Another thing you can do is look at some of the trade publications like R&D Directions or Applied Clinical Trials. You can get trial subscriptions of these, I think, very often for free. And in there, they give you information about drug pipeline. And then lastly, if you're scientifically inclined and you're particularly interested in a particular therapeutic area, you can go onto Medline and you can identify published studies of investigational products in animals that may be very early on, that would give you an idea that something is moving into phase 1, or look for phase 1 types of studies, pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic, absorption, metabolism, excretion studies that might give you an idea that a drug is in phase 1 and moving forward into later phases. So I think these two websites I gave you are probably pretty good, but you might also look at some of these other ways to perhaps identify opportunities. Okay, I don't see any other questions, but I have to appreciate all of you attending today. I hope you found the information helpful. If you would like to send me a private question or communication, please don't hesitate to do so, and I will respond. And again, thanks for taking the time and participating today.